The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Welcome everyone to the Lighting Controls Podcast. We've got a super exciting episode for you today with Gary Meshberg. He's got a lot of great stuff to talk about. But first, we want to thank our sponsor, Toggled. And Ron's going to talk a little bit about Toggled and their products.
Yeah, Toggled is part of a global tech leader that provides software and cloud solutions for simulation, IoT, high-performance computing, data analytics. They really have a grassroots approach to NLC, network lighting controls. What makes it really cool is they put Bluetooth in all of their lamps, which is something that's unique to the lighting industry. So existing direct wire retrofits are just a tube swap away from adding controls. Wireless, ideal for adding controls to existing buildings, no teardowns. Cybersecurity is really what they've got a big focus on. So they've got a lot of approach into cybersecurity and their gateway to connect you to cloud. They don't have any fees for their API integration, which is a really cool feature that they offer. They're very customer centric. That's a big focus for them. And Toggled views the building holistically versus segmented control, which has been a really big thing for us that we've been talking about.
So check out Toggled. TOGGLED.com. They've got some great stuff for you if you're looking for unique applications within our industry. We also want to mention that this podcast is presented by the Lighting Controls Association, or LCA, and is financially supported by NAILD, the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. Additionally, if you're listening to this on getagriponlighting.com, you should check out lightingcontrolspodcast.com, where you can find other episodes of this podcast series, news on lighting controls, and any merch that might be particular to the show. Thanks so much, and here's Gary. Welcome back, everyone, to the Lighting Controls Podcast, where we like to talk about lighting controls. Today, we have a really interesting guest here, Gary Meshberg. Gary, do you want to give us a quick 1-2 on who you are and what you do?
Sure, Webster. Thanks for having me. So I have been in the lighting and lighting controls industry for 35 years. Started off in distribution for a couple of quick years, and then spent 20 plus years with Lightlear and was responsible for specification selling, and then actually was responsible for the controls business for Lightlear for Canada, and then transitioned to the US with Genlight Controls for the Americas as a sales and marketing capacity. And then most recently, for the past 13 years, I've been with Digital Lumens Incorporated, and we have two brands called Encelium and Digital Lumens, focusing on network lighting controls. Also do some volunteer work for the Lighting Controls Association, currently serve as vice chair, and have done two-year terms on and off as chair and vice chair, as well as some committee work with the IES.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here. And just in case, because I forgot to mention it, we're your hosts for this podcast, Webster Marsh and Ron, is it Kuzma?
Kuzma.
You'll
get it one of these days. Don't worry. One of these days you'll get it.
How many of these have you done?
So everyone gets my last name wrong. It's fine. We're used to it.
But at any rate, so thank you for joining us, Gary. I mean, you really have a history in our industry, not just with lighting controls, but with lighting in general. And, you know, Lightlear really is an interesting group that has kind of created a lot of people who kind of stay in our industry. And, you know, I'm not marketing them by any means, but I'm just saying that we see a lot of lighting controls specialists coming out from Lightlear at times. And there's also other groups like that produce really expertise people in lighting controls. But, you know, I'm just curious what your perspective is, since you've had such an interesting trajectory within the industry, where lighting controls is, where you think it's going to go. What do you think are any of the major challenges right now? And if you have any ideas of how to overcome those.
Yeah, a lot in that one question. So let me see if I can unpack that a little bit here. Yeah. So where is lighting controls today? Certainly the energy codes seem to have put wind in the sails of lighting controls in general. It's kind of a double-edged sword when you have the adoption of LED, which really does take the connected lighting load down considerably by 60% or thereabouts, depending on the design. So what's left to control? Why should we or would we do this? And then you say, okay, well, energy codes have a place in creating a justification for that. Additionally, we're starting to see greater use cases. Right now, or historically, it's been about the energy savings, load shedding, basically what is the ROI, and more what we're seeing now is what are the occupant experiences and those benefits. If it's just too bright, being able to trim high end and low end, being able to put light where and when it's needed, as well as the data mining. That's where it's heading. You asked, I would say one of the next larger holy grails is the ability to have your building communicate back to you, provide information.
Sure.
The uses of spaces, so space optimization, space utilization, very similar to our newer cars these days that have hotspots built into them and tell you if you've left your car unlocked, where your car is, if your window has been left open. These are all, in some cases, by default with the newer car, and it connects right to your phone and it provides this level of information. And if you don't have it or haven't had it, you don't really miss it. You don't know kind of what's there until you have it. And then it's like, that's a very nice amenity to have. So I'd say that where lighting controls are still trying to provide the so what? What's the real occupant benefit for a lighting control system? And let me qualify by saying lighting control system. In this particular case, I'm talking about more than just a sensor, maybe a power pack, a wall switch in a room, something that has a dashboard that provides a network or a front-end GUI or dashboard that provides the ability for the sensors and the devices that are deployed within the building to communicate back to a computer, and that therefore provides information to building management systems or smartphones and other types of uses for the data that's being collected from sensors anyway. So with that understanding of what I'm qualifying as a lighting control system versus just a standalone room, as an example.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, we're at a point where, because of the code requirements, we've landed in a more advanced technological state with lighting controls than possibly where we would have ended up without that motivation. And then, as a result, we have the ability to really tap into that technology and utilize it for other purposes, not just exclusive to turning the lights on and off.
Yeah. So one thing I'd add to that is when you look at various building systems, HVAC, fire, security, card access, lots of systems, and some of them are vying for the control of the building. And where we are from the lighting industry, not even controls, but the lighting industry is we're so far, I would say far ahead, but actually ideally poised to take advantage of this technology, because we have two things going for us. One, access to power, right? Power everywhere above our heads. The other part is the deployment, ubiquitous lighting. It's everywhere. So I could have lights in front of me, behind me, to the sides, could provide triangulation, or if I'm trying to get data or do asset tracking, or some of the greater value. And this is value beyond lighting, beyond ROI, beyond energy savings, beyond sometimes even just the data itself, just the ability to harness what's already up in the ceiling. And that's a struggle for the HVAC folks that have thermostats on the wall, perhaps, maybe not ideally located, or automated door locks, right? They might be throughout the building, but again, access to power and access to location might be a bit of a rub. So for us, this is great news, because as we start to see adoption of network lighting control systems and really get our arms around, hey, what this data can really provide to the owner, to the occupant experience, we are ideally positioned to take advantage just by the virtue of where we're located.
Mm-hmm. So then what do you think the barrier is to adoption of that mindset? Because I would say that that's not a consistent mindset in our industry right now.
Sure. Information, I would say, is one barrier. Just providing why are we doing this in the first place. And don't get me wrong, a lot of people do get it. If you're talking about a multi-building university campus, that might be more intuitive. Or somebody might think, yeah, I definitely need that level of information. versus a 10-story office building that is not part of a network of office buildings. So it's a one-off building. I think information is a bit of a barrier. I think there's certainly lots of systems on the market, lots of protocols, wired or wireless, individual fixture controls, zone-based, lots of lighting protocols, Bluetooth Low Energy, 0 to 10 volt Dolly. So, and we're also getting, I would say we're advancing in just the comfort and experience level of the installer. Many years ago, I was part of the Home Lighting Control Alliance. This was the home automation folks, and they started to realize that, hey, there's more than just a home theater in a home, in these custom homes. And it took a while for lighting control in the home to really gain some strength and get some teeth, because it was the installers that just didn't know what to do. They kind of shied away from it, or actually resisted it and tried to talk the owner out of that. And that changed because there were security systems going into homes. There were home theaters in the home, and they looked at network lighting control in the home as just a natural next step or next amenity to the home. And so the installer base had to come along with the product development and enhancements to really make that side of the industry move forward. And we're starting to see that now. We're starting to get more educated installers. There seems to be less, from my perspective, less apprehension. Still some apprehension. So some of the education needs to be there as a logical next step, or what needs to be there. And that's, education is a barrier, awareness is a barrier. But as far as technology, pricing seems to be very competitive these days. Choice of system and scalability from small to large seems to be there. So I would say getting the awareness at the owner architect level. The engineers are mostly familiar with these types of systems, but the value beyond just saving a watt. And really, I'll just finish with saying the occupant experience seems to be more and more prevalent. We saw what happened with COVID and how that changed our workspace, and either disinfection. When should we disinfect a room? Well, if we had the data, we might be able to tell how many wipe downs we should do a day. Or nurses at a nurses station, day one in their new hospital are in a lot of cases just overlit because we put in the lighting weighting factors, and so we're overlit day one. And so the occupant comfort message also is, and that's something that doesn't normally get talked about because that's not kind of how we design. We don't typically design around occupant comfort, but there's a really big part of that in there.
Well, and I think, you have a really interesting position as part of a manufacturer to see kind of the trade winds of what's happening as a result of COVID. I mean, the biggest thing right now, at least to my perspective, is supply chain issues. With most manufacturers, there's always a challenge of trying to provide the product as to the delivery date of what the project needs. But that being put aside, you're bringing up some other interesting changes in our industry that are as a result of this pandemic that has hopefully, is in the rear view mirror now. But, so are you seeing that there's a higher demand for this focus on occupant comfort? No,
I would say in general, higher demand. No, I think, I think when it's communicated about the benefits and what it can do, certainly people will say, sure, if I can get that, that would be great. Unless there's a pain point, if there's a problem you're trying to solve up front, like a nurse at a nurse's station can't see the screens or having fatigue and headache or eye strain. In general, but I would say that the upside benefits are really at the owner level not communicated as well as we probably could, and sometimes, if I can just add to that,
go for it.
Sometimes the owners aren't interested. You're trying to get an audience, right, and saying, hey, we'd like to tell you about this, and just I'm okay with this, and I'm not really wanting to spend the time to really learn more about the system benefits beyond energy savings.
Well, and that brings up a curious question here. I'm curious to see what your response is, but whose responsibility is it to inform the owner of the potential and what a lighting control system can bring to the table for their project?
Yeah, it depends on who has what agenda. If an installer thinks that it might complicate their life, they might shy away from that. If an architect says it might enhance their building, they might more aggressively promote that and try to foster that level of communication or dialogue. Ultimately, I think it's depending on the type of project, whose responsibility. I'm with a manufacturer, so the manufacturer, look, we're trying to promote our product, so we have a direct responsibility to reach to the specification community, the end users, maybe BOMA facility folks, and touch on those different points. But they're also getting that from other manufacturers in other industry. So it's sometimes hard to get that level of attention. So it depends on the job, but ultimately who's responsible? I probably would say everybody.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with you. All right, it is everybody. I want to circle back. You mentioned the pricing sort of coming back in line, right? And obviously, being with the manufacturer, you see it differently than some of us, and then owners do. And I'm curious how you think the pricings come in line. I only ask because a lot of owners, and this goes back to the education, and it loops right back to what we were just talking about. But a lot of owners still don't see the value or don't understand the value. So even when we hit them with a price tag that we feel is reasonable, they still see it as an extremely high expense, and they don't understand the benefits they're getting out of it. So circling back to education, it's everybody's job, but how do we actually get the correct information in front of the hands of the owners and the people buying these projects to explain to them and have them see the value in lighting control systems, in building control systems?
Yeah. For clarity, when I mentioned pricing, what I was referring to at that point, and I'll touch on what your comment is, Ron, is from one manufacturer. If there's only one manufacturer, then sometimes you don't have a competitive nature. When you have different manufacturers with wired and wireless and all sorts of options, then it tends to level the playing field a little bit, right? And you have scalability and you have competitive bids. So that's what I was talking about from a pricing standpoint. However, if you're competing against a 99-cent on-off switch, and you're saying, hey, how do I get somebody to go from that mindset to something completely different in terms of a price scale, then it goes back into the education side of it. And so what are the benefits? Usually focusing on what is the problem we're trying to solve. And if there's a good anchoring point there to be able to say, this is the information, this is the energy savings, and it's usually a number of different things. One of the tools which is the integrated lighting campaign, I serve on that committee as well. What we try to do there, it's a PNNL through the DOE. What we try to do there is really just focus on case studies, show examples of exemplary applications where this is what they did and how they did it. And it's hard in a 1 or 2 pager to really communicate that. So we're trying at different levels from the manufacturers, from the specification community, from third party like a DOE to really get the word out.
Nice.
So
awesome.
There's a lot of outreach going on to try to connect with ownership, facility management, or just anybody who has a stake in the game when it comes to a decision like this. But it doesn't sound like the message is really reaching the target audience, or at least is starting to reach it, but not necessarily. We're not really seeing a sweeping adoption as of yet.
Yeah, how do we succinctly focus on, okay, Gary, this is what it can do for you in a general sense without knowing exactly what your pain point might be, and at least to get your interest. And I always ask myself, if I'm looking to buy something, whether it's a system or a car or a toy or whatever it might be, is that how do I find that information? right online, or was there something that actually I became aware of through media at some level that sparked my interest in doing something or learning about something? Certainly, if you're a building owner, you might depend on your specification team to be able to provide that level of insight. But it goes back to the OPR, right? The owner's project requirements. What are those requirements? And that's a little bit of also a challenge in the industry to really zero in on that. That leads us into all the other things that we struggle with on the lighting controls side is sequence of operations and design intent narratives and how to deliver a quality system and a quality building at the end of the day.
I mean, I guess I'm curious if there's a risk of us having to continue to crutch on energy code then to motivate adoption, because it seems as though that's how we got where we are right now. Is energy code has motivated adoption of vacancy sensors, for instance, but it doesn't say now use that data to automate your building. It just says you need to shut your lighting off. And it seems as though the best way to cause sweeping change is to make it a requirement as opposed to an option.
Sure. And one way you can force it through codes and regulations, legislation. Another way is you just make it so attractive that people would want to do it and say, that's like, what am I going to put into my building? I mean, what's my carpet and floor and furniture selection, and what are the other things I could spend money on in my building? And that this one is something that could be not a nice to have, but a need to have beyond code compliant sensors and switches and power packs in rooms and so on. But beyond that, and we're kind of getting there, right? So if you look at the minimum criteria, especially with the newer codes that are out, with smaller zones of occupancy, sometimes overlapping zones, plug load control, demand response, that's raised the minimum threshold pretty high. So the leap then to lighting control systems is certainly not as great as it was. So, but there is still a leap. So how do we minimize that or try to neutralize that? Perhaps, Ron, to your point about the added cost objection, is to say, look at these other things. You're much more responsive to the users in your building. People are more comfortable. We'll get into tunable lighting and to other value adds within the lighting system. And I think we're actually just right at the starting point, because there's a lot of talk about tunable light as well as IoT, but not a lot of adoption. I'm just in general, right? So we think of where this conversation might be 5 short years from now, is lighting by default tunable light standard? Is lighting controls, are they built into luminaires? Standard. There's options now for that. But I think that one manufacturer might want to get a jump on the next, and that will hopefully raise all boats float in this case, to be able to say there's things like that are just available by default. I'll give you one quick example. When we were in the fluorescent age, dimming was optional. So, and I'll just give you some rough numbers here, but let's say a standard non-dim fluorescent ballast was about $15. The dimming version, or the dimmable version of that, let's say 0 to 10 volt, was $40 to $50. So if you wanted to dim, you really wanted to dim, right? Because it was quite a bit more money. Where when we came out with LEDs, the industry kind of went there as well. Said, hey, we have dimming and non-dimming, and we'll try to capture a premium for it, for the dimming driver. And that lasted 6 months or so. And then dimming became standard. So now you have LED luminaires that are dimmable for free, right? I mean, it's in the cost of the fixture, but you're not paying the premium. So of course codes, and we see things adopt to say, hey, now that you have it, so now that you need to do something with that. But so what's the next threshold that says, okay, now luminaires come out of the box smart, or luminaires come out of the box with the color changing ability? It's not anytime soon, or smart in terms of an IoT platform. But when you start to see where we could go with the lighting and electricity available on the ceiling, there's just some really exciting opportunities ahead of us.
Well, so I mean, it's interesting because if we look at it through that lens with the fluorescent ballasts, and then how LED just kind of standardized dimming, it's assumed you're going to have dimming no matter what fixture you use. I guess the question here is with lighting controls, why don't we do that? Why don't we just make it so that all lighting control systems are standard to a format that is, okay, you're going to have X, Y, and Z. And then the expectation is, okay, you have the capability of doing it whether you use it or not, as opposed to, well, now you need to add this to your system.
I have an opinion. I don't know, I would say it's the right one, but
Go for
so
it.
what is that? What is that standard platform? I guess it's probably the statement. And is that a 0 to 10
Sure.
volt, or Dolly more prevalent in Europe than it is in North America? And it's probably the one that takes the lead, right? That one that's most successful wins beta versus VHS, for that whole argument back in the day. So also, if it was so obvious that it was worth doing, and people would say, hey, would I spend another $1, $2, $10 per luminaire to have that built in? Because it'd be so obvious, right? Of course I want that, because look at everything I can do with it. So that value proposition probably is not as well entrenched to say, hey, look, we're going to do this because we're shipping so many products already with this requirement built into it, then we're just going to make it standard. It's probably cheaper for us to do that as one SKU versus 2 SKUs or a special on my production line. So, but again, I think we're still a long way off from that.
So do you think that home automation, right? Everyone sort of, you can buy any smart lamp from anywhere these days, right? Any of the box stores, anywhere online. Do you think the adoption of smart home, lighting, lamps, switches, things like that are going to help us more as we sort of try to make this push for larger lighting control systems in buildings? Is this helping or is it hindering?
Yeah, I think anytime you have something that you experience firsthand, you ask yourself, hey, how do I do more of that, or how can I get more of that? And what I do in my car, for years, you get in your car, you close the door, and your dome light would dim down. And then we didn't have any dimmers in our house. Right. So the more we use those, we're exposed to, and also the comfort level. Hey, I did that. I tried it. It worked. I love it. I'm putting more of them in, and I'm comfortable with that level of technology. Maybe I'll invest more. I'll carve out more dollars towards that in terms of enhancing my lifestyle or my home or my building or my car. So absolutely, yeah. And a lot of the commercial building systems came out of residential home automation as well.
Right. So what about the end users who have those horrible experiences, right? There are a lot of people who are not necessarily as tech savvy and have a lot of issues setting up these devices, right? And those people, not saying they are or aren't, but I'm sure there's plenty of those people who are the owners and the owners' reps who've had these horrible experiences in their personal lives, who then look at it on a larger building and go, there is no way this system is going to work properly based on my experience of X, Y, and Z. So how do we help fix that? Because that is a big roadblock.
Yeah, part of that is making sure on a commercial level that things are well documented. There's service plans that are part of a specification that says, hey, we really want to make sure our owners are trained. Yeah, again, part of the specifications, like how do we give that building manager a leg up? Right, the first year, they may opt out and say, but I really want them to get off to a good start, understand what they have, and chances are well-trained, well-educated. Look, we all had to learn Word and Excel and PowerPoint, or a lot of us did, right? And without knowing some of those formulas, it's kind of frustrating. But once you know it, it's like, wow, look at how efficient this is and how easy it is to use. So part of that is that education up front. So we need to be conscious of that and making sure that, hey, if there's an owner's training, make sure there's an owner's training, not just on paper, but it actually happens and people sign off on it, and do it again if it needs to, if there's a change of staff, and just be willing to make sure that you have that customer care in mind, right down to an individual person that says, I understand this is what we need to do. This is long-term will help the client. going back to your comment though, if somebody has a bad experience, sometimes if somebody has a good experience, they may not tell anybody. But if somebody has a bad experience, they like to tell everybody. It
That's
seems
right.
that there's a lot of that. So to undo some of that, and if somebody does have a bad experience, unfortunately, they may say, "Hey, I'm just not going down that road again. I've been there, gave it a try. It's just not for me," and or couldn't get past it, or didn't see the benefit of it, couldn't get the right part of the right service, or I just didn't understand it, or maybe they didn't take time to understand it. So part of that is, and I think a lot of us have had that, myself included, have had that experience. Is so how do you minimize that from happening? Will you eliminate it? No, there'll always be that segment of our industry that says I'm just resistant to it. I think somebody's been on the job for 40 years may be less resistant to somebody who's 35 years old, has technology, grew up with it, and is more open-minded to saying, "Oh yeah, why would I run around my building to find out what might be causing an issue versus looking on a computer screen to determine that."
Right.
So I'm not sure if I really answered your question specifically, but I think it was, how do we try to minimize the bad experiences? So there's some fail safes you can put in up front to make sure that gets done, and hold people accountable, saying, was it commissioned, and were the people trained, who were they? And really we want to close that loop. I work with some specifiers that they write in, and I applaud them for doing this actually, they write in a 1-year service agreement, and it costs money, right? So we're offering, manufacturers are offering, or the agents might do it themselves, or a third party might do it, that says, hey, we're offering VIP treatment, rapid response, on-site services, right? Hotline assistance, but there's a cost to that. So the specifier said, hey, I'm going to put that in because I know that the facility manager probably won't touch lighting and lighting control for the first year. It's on, it works, everybody's happy. I got other problems that I move into my building to deal with. And I want to make sure that they have that first year or 2 years to say, okay, 6 months when they actually get into maybe needing to work on some of their lighting needs, that they have that support from the manufacturer, from the rep at some level. And that's put into the bid process. If one manufacturer offers it and another doesn't, then sometimes the bids get unbalanced and somebody says, hey, look, I have that in my price and I don't. That's why my price may look more or less than my competition. So sometimes they just get eliminated. But if it's part of the specification, it certainly helps keep the playing field level.
Yeah, and you mentioned commissioning agents, and I think that commissioning agents are a huge piece, especially for lighting, because you're right. Most owners don't touch the lighting in their buildings for the first 6 months or a year. And depending on the warranties, contractor's gone, and then all of a sudden they're like, I don't know, this thing never worked. That's where the commissioning agent really comes into play, right? Because they're the ones who are signing off on it for the owner, saying, yes, we've gone through this with the contractors, with the integrator. We know that all of this is working appropriately. Whether or not they love the programming is another story that you can take up with the design team and this and that, right? But you can fix that later. Knowing that it works is a huge thing. And that's where I don't know if enough people understand the value in commissioning agents. I have been driven crazy by many a commissioning agent as an integrator on a project, but they're there to do their job to make sure the system functions the way it's supposed to. So I, as much as they drive me crazy, advocate for commissioning agents because they offer a ton of value to projects.
Yeah, right. So there's a commissioning authority, a CXA, and then there's the programming tech that will commission the system. So just to be clear on the roles and responsibilities, when a manufacturer or a manufacturer's representative is going to program the system, so lighting control system startup, if you will, part of that service includes, for the most part, an owner's training. And sometimes they don't even show up for their own training. It's like, hey, that's not my most important thing to deal with today, even though the manufacturer or the representative is on site. Once that's all dialed in, then if there happens to be a commissioning agent or a CXA on this particular project, they'll come in and do the measurement and verification, right? That things are dialed in and set up accordingly, according to the sequence of operations, OPR, if you go backwards.
Yep.
And then come back to say, okay, I'm signing off on this because it's commissioned correctly, but I don't know if all commissioning authorities, maybe you guys can help me on this, actually look and saying, were the owners trained as part of the commissioning process, or was it just making sure that the set points were dialed in correctly?
Well, I think Lynn would have a lot of comments to make on that.
Sure.
But, I think as far as commissioning goes, we really kind of bastardize that term in our industry.
That is true.
Commissioning really is talking about a holistic process that starts from beginning of the project and follows through to the end of the project. And so an ideal commissioning agent is going to make sure that the owner's trained, or the owner's rep is trained to the system and based on their need. Whereas we like to use in the lighting industry a lot the term commissioning to refer to the programming, startup, training, et cetera, that happens during the construction process. And I don't think that we should continue to refer to service technicians as commissioners, because they're not commissioners. They are a service technician. And even integrators can sometimes be referred to as commissioners, and they're not. They're integrators.
Right. Yeah, I do like LCSS, Lighting Control System Startup.
Yes. Yeah, and so lighting control system startup includes hopefully a lot of stuff, but startup really just refers to energizing the system and making sure that it doesn't explode. And so, when it comes to startup, you need training in addition. You need programming in addition. Startup is not programming.
Yeah. In my definition of LCSS, I would consider that to be starting up the system, making sure the smoke doesn't come out of the parts, that it's been installed correctly, it's operating correctly, and that it's referencing back to the construction documents and sequence of operations that were provided. That's what I would say. That's a startup. I mean, you can I would say energize is different than startup even, right? So
fair enough.
So we would say
and
that
I think
startup.
I think that continues to harp on a point that we really have. It's come up in a lot of conversations where we don't have consistent definitions in our industry. And so, the fact that I say energize and you disagree that that's not part of startup, there are manufacturers and engineers out there who would disagree with your position and say, no, startup includes energization.
Right. So Ron, back to your earlier question, you had talked about somebody who had a good or bad experience. Just this conversation about what do we call things, right?
Yep.
So before we can say anything about the owner, do we have our house in order to make sure that and that's where LP 16 comes into place, LP 8, which we're working on right now as a committee, to help with the narratives, sequence of operations, the commissioning process.
These are IES documents, just to clarify to our listeners.
Exactly, thanks. So from an industry standpoint, trying to get back to some kind of standardization, what do we call things? What does that actually mean to help, just because it becomes commonplace. I mean, that's now a term that's used and everybody agrees that that's what it means.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the IES definitely has a heavy lift when it comes to narrowing down definitions and finding consensus, because, I feel as though a number of manufacturers would butt heads if they start solidifying definitions that call into question process, device, procedure, and because I know a number of manufacturers who in their data sheets or in their instruction manuals have different terms that they'd have to go through those documents once there's a solidified definition and fix that.
Sure.
Even with the 0 to 10 volt change of color, where it used to be pink and gray, it's now purple and pink, or I'm sorry, lavender and gray, and now it's purple and pink. There's still manufacturers out there who have their existing documents and they haven't updated them yet to reflect that change. And the IES has already produced plenty of materials on consensus for definitions, and there's still resistance to adoption towards that.
Mm-hmm. Even at the specification level, you being a former specifier, Webster, you will appreciate this, that symbology is different. It might be a zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, or it might be a subscript A, B, C to indicate the control zones. So you have a wide variety of manufacturers, and the way they build and put together their system, configure their system might be different, and the specifications might be different from one firm to the next. So I think to ultimately, like, if you ask ourselves, what is the problem we're trying to solve, is deliver a quality building to a quality systems and quality building, and minimize the disruption downstream. Right, Ron, to your point, right? Improve that ultimate occupant experience as they move into the building and then also settle into their building. So how do we do that, right? I think some of these IES documents are a really great initiative to try and get some consistent baselines. So we start to see go from one specifier to the next, or if we talk about energize or system startup or commissioning, that we all have some clear understandings. And again, some growing pains within the industry. We're probably late to the dance in terms of getting these things done, but we are working on it.
Sure, and I'm not trying to disparage manufacturers, because they have a lot of work that they're trying to do to maintain their systems and make sure that they're specified appropriately. So I mean, there's already a lot going on without having to then change your definitions, change your drawings that you've already leaned hard on to support your system. So there's just sort of this challenge for us in the industry to be able to create consensus with definitions. And so I think, the term commissioning, for instance, is a perfect example of where we need to come to a consensus, so that we don't accidentally say something we don't mean to, or ask for a service we didn't intend to ask for, or worse yet, we don't have a service that we wanted to ask for. And because we assumed that commissioning included X, Y, and Z, then, okay, well, where's X, Y, and Z? We said commissioning. Well, our commissioning doesn't include X, Y, and Z. So, there's a challenge there for us in the industry to really collaborate and make sure that this will work out in the end. But I think, to your point with specifiers, and from my experience with specifiers, it's also difficult to keep consensus even internally at times, because you'll have different project managers, different designers, and different workflows involved in creating the design documentation to support the system. And additionally, depending on which manufacturer you're working with to create that system, your definitions and your symbology may change.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. This is the way we've done it for the last 10 years. We have newer technology and systems that we're now putting into our specifications, but we really don't want to redo all of our specifications. And again, this is just from what I've seen out there, and some do it really, really well, and some do it, somewhat less than that. Now, I think the firms that do it really, really well have sat back and said, okay, we need to rebuild this, the way we're putting our documentation together. And it's quite a bit of work to be able to break down and say, okay, if we're going to do this to be somewhat fair to various manufacturers, because there might be a 3-name bid as an example, to be able, like they've meaning the specification community has really honed the lighting fixture schedule as newer technologies have come into play. They've added different columns and been able to adapt or put notes in to really adapt to that. The same level of care on the controls specification and being able to document that, again, from one project manager to the next within the same firm, or just as a firm overall, being just current with what's on the market.
So, I mean, I'm actually going to pull out a moment, if you don't mind, that you and I chatted about some time ago now. But, when it comes to specifications and it comes to vague clarifications or just scope gaps in general, as a manufacturer, it was very interesting to hear what your default response is, where it's sort of like, well, what do we provide for this, where it just says, and make it so.
Great question. So when we go, and I'll default to a lighting control system startup. When we do the startup, programming soup to nuts, right, to the owner's training, we will ask, and if it's not in the specification, we'll try and default back to what do the construction documents say. They may not say, you must have a time schedule. Well, what is that time schedule? And what is it by different spaces within the building, the exterior versus the lobby? So, and it's not unusual to not have that information. So, all right, we know this, the building is getting ready. The tech is going to go out in 2 weeks to do the control system startup. Hey, can we get that information? So we actually have a form. We'll send it out and say, can you? It's actually part of the request. It says, when you are requesting a tech to come out and start up the system, can you please provide the information, which includes the time schedule and well, we have a 3 scene in the conference room. What are those scenes? So our default is, and in many cases, you're just not going to get that information. And we try to be proactive so we don't have to go chase people around through the building to say, hey, come on over here and tell me what you want this button station to do. Right? So we can be efficient in our use of time. Ron, you're smiling because you've probably been there. So we have a document that will say, if we don't have this information available to us, this is what we're going to provide you. And it's not to be hardball. It's just like managing expectations, right? So we're going to give you a 7-7 or a 90-60-30 on your 3 scene wall station. That gives you some idea of what you're starting with. Because somebody might say, look, we don't know. We haven't moved into the building yet. We don't know how we're going to use our conference room. So just give us something, but we would like to know what that something is. So that's the documentation we'll provide back.
And I think that says a lot to the programmer too, right? The lighting programmer, because most owners don't necessarily know what they want. So it really comes down to, and I know it can be extremely tough to get the owners present during startup, but it really comes down to the programmer being able to explain their system, that they're programming to the end user. I was on a site just yesterday reprogramming a system that was started up a year ago because the owner wanted to make some changes, and no big deal. But there was a lot of just not understanding. It was, hey, I want to add an extra button to this touchscreen. Sure, no problem. I'd really like to do this. You know, it was a theater, so it was, hey, when we go into show mode, I have to turn off this light, switch to this page, pull down these 5 faders, and I'd really like to do this as all just one sequence. Sure, we can do that, right? Do that, create the sequence, and then plunges the space into darkness. Great, except it's a single button. And I was like, what if we had a "Are you sure" button? And they were like, that's the most amazing thing ever. You could do that? And I was like, of course we can. Like, here, I'll even make it flash green, and I'll make the no flash red, and it's fancy, and it looks great. But it makes someone have to choose. But all that comes down to being able to, and it comes down to time and having the owner present, but being able to sit down with them and explain to them what these systems can do and the power of the system, and try and walk through those scenarios with them of how do you envision using this specific space. And right. I think the more we can spend time with the owners and get project reps and lighting designers and everyone else to understand all the nuances of this stuff, the better all these projects are going to go, the more adaption we're going to see moving forward.
Right. So in lieu of that, because I get that's a holy grail. If we could get that, get a lot of people
it never happens.
Understand what they need. Right. So what we can do goes back to how do we allow for that, right? Because we know at some point, somebody, it might take 6 months, but somebody might ask that question. It's like, hey, I wish you could do this, or I need some help. And that's where the documents can come into play, right? And again, it keeps it fair for the reps and the manufacturers to be able to bid competitively, where we all know what we're including in our scope, not just from a bill of materials standpoint, because you need the parts and smarts, but beyond that to say, okay, yes, the specifiers had conversations with the architect and the owner, and the intent is that somebody will come back in 6 months on site to help us with these changes. As now we're settled into our building, we know what we like, we know what maybe not like, and great. So I'll just allow for it. And as I mentioned before, installers, the reps, the manufacturers, we're there. The systems are in place to be able to allow for that and provide that level of service. In a lot of cases, the manufacturers reps have very robust control staff departments that they look at doing that. But again, a lot of that, unless you're just a good person, it doesn't come free. So there's some things that you might do, Ron, in your business to say, hey, I want to make sure I really take care of this client because I want the next building and the building after that from them. But in a lot of cases, it's a one-off project, and we want to make sure that they're super happy with it. We want them to tell other building owners and their friends that they really should have put or shall put these types of things in their building. Go back to that satisfaction. Boy, a trained user, usually your greatest fan, because typically on any system, because they know how to use it, they love it, right? I do a lot of traveling. I'll go into a rental car, and I'll get into the car, and I can't touch the pedals, and the steering wheel is way too high, and the seat's back, and the rear view mirror, and the radio was set to 8 on a station I didn't care for, and my first minute in that car, I really don't like the car. It has nothing to do with the car. So commissioning, this is my bad example here, and my bad analogy is that I adjust the seat, adjust the steering wheel, I get things in, and all of a sudden it's super comfortable, and I'm enjoying it that much more.
Well, I think to the point of the engineer that you were referring to before with the 1-year follow-up or the 1-year service agreement, it's not really until you're in the car that you're going to know. And basically, if you program the system with the owner standing there while, the ceiling is incomplete and they don't even have the furniture in the room, of course they're not going to know what they want. They're just going to say, okay, that looks fine. Or they may have an idea, but then when they get their furniture in, when everything's finished, they may want to change how everything functions. And so it's like if you were at the desk to the rental agency and they're like, okay, how do you want your seat adjusted? It's like, I don't know. So I think, Ron's example, that was a year ago. That was a year since startup. And then they had an idea of what they wanted because they knew the things that they didn't like.
Right. But it's a great example. So they know that they don't know, right? They're just, yes, put this in my building. Yeah, I understand. I get a general idea of what we'll do. But we do, right? As specifiers, as manufacturers, as reps, we typically know that, they might need some help. Unless there's a fantastic training at the end of the lighting control system startup, and they're good to go. Here's a video. Here's your training session. You guys are awesome. Away you go. But they're still going to settle into their building and may need a helping hand down the road. So I'm just saying, as an industry, how do we help ourselves as being able to say, okay, let's anticipate that. Let's do a better job at really making sure that people have just an incredible experience with our systems and their building. And therefore, it's almost, you make your bed, and they'll likely do it again if they have the choice on another building, on the next building, or certainly if they're involved in associations or talking with other colleagues, certainly talk about, gosh, this thing is really awesome. You should see this. Look at my phone. Well, see what I can do on this thing? And it becomes a sense of pride versus a sense of maybe aggravation.
So we're almost out of time, but I want to encapsulate this because I think we've had a really interesting journey of a conversation here where, we started with energy code compliance and we've ended with basically 1-year service agreements. And the thing here is that because energy code has motivated us to adopt this, sweeping technology, this really interesting stuff, we're just not tapping into the capabilities of our system right now. But it sounds as though if we have as standard 1-year service agreements for every single system, so that when the owner or occupants of the building have experience with what's going on, they can then revise the system based on their needs. That would be the solution to a lot of the heartburn that people experience when it comes to lighting control systems. And so, a lot of what we've discussed here is, okay, who's responsible for what? And it really is the group responsibility to make sure that this is a possibility. Because I know there are a number of manufacturers out there, and there are even specifiers out there who will eliminate the service agreement from their bids, their proposals, whatever, because they're afraid of the owner pushing back and saying that's too expensive. I don't want that. And
Good
really,
point.
it's our responsibility, everybody's responsibility, to say, hold on. I just want to be clear. This isn't like you're going through Best Buy and they're saying, hey, you should tack on for this USB dongle that's going to break in 5 minutes. This is your building. this is everything when it comes to lighting controls. Make sure you absolutely don't want this, because otherwise you're going to be left out to dry if you want to do something different, and you're going to have to pay for that.
Sure. Yeah. To be clear, let's certainly be aware that if a customer calls up and pick a manufacturer, and they call up their 24/7 or whatever tech support line, they'll typically get service and get answers, right? And this is not the manufacturer's warranty, right? This is beyond that. Manufacturer's warranty is like if parts and smarts fail, then there's a replacement for a defined period of time. This is that extra level of customer care that's saying, hey, we want to come out to your building in 6 months. We want to sit down with you. Hey, you have some new staff. We want to train those new staff. We want to make sure that you are absolutely delighted with your building and getting as much as you can from it. So that's, and it sounds like an evangelist and really sells or promote the sale of service agreements. I'm just trying to promote the use of the system and getting all you can from all you've got. If that's a way to ensure that there's time set aside for it, and there's in the bid, because it's always hard to find money after the fact, right? So if that's allowed for, then again, it levels the playing field. We all understand what we want the owner to be able to do with the system and enjoy their building and technology, and it's allowed for. And it's usually not that much in terms of the from a cost of you building it. It's breadcrumbs on the table. It's very, very small, and from the benefit of that is much bigger in terms of the gains that you'll have from your system.
Right, because I mean it's an extra layer of support essentially. It's not again, okay, fine, your occupancy sensor broke within the 5-year warranty, it gets replaced, but it's more of, hey, I have no idea what to expect for this system. And so within that year period, I can make changes to how it's programmed and how it operates. I can't add a new keypad without it being an extra cost, but I can at least reconsider how I'm using a space, for instance. Conference room, I can think about a conference room of how it's going to be used in the end, but it may get used in a completely different way by the time that 1 year rolls around. So I think it's just, and it also gives the ability to have somebody come to the site and talk to you about the system you have, as opposed to the phone service. A lot of people dislike phone support because they don't have a person to interact with. The person's not looking at the equipment they're looking at. So having that extra layer of somebody coming over and saying, okay, here's what you have, here's how you interact with it. Here, let me do a little bit of reprogramming, put in a warning that says, are you absolutely sure you want to shut everything into blackness? That's really what we're talking about here, is that extra layer that I think, a lot of specifiers, at least, get frustrated because they become the 911 to an owner after occupancy. And that's where integrators fill the gap, because if their number's right on the panel, then hopefully they're going to get the phone call because they're local and can program it. But if the manufacturer is really the one who's supporting and surveying that, then that's included in the cost of the system. It's not extra labor.
Sure. Hey, Ron, to your earlier point, when somebody has had a bad experience and you ask me, how do we overcome that? That might be a tool to say, look, we understand that there's a lot to learn when you first move into your building of all the different types of systems you have. So we're going to put this level of service in there. We want you to have a good experience when you're ready, because you probably won't be ready for the first 6 months. And then, but just know that if you have any apprehension about this, we have already included and anticipated that phone call where you want to make some adjustments and tweaking, which is perfectly normal, perfectly understandable, and we're ready when you are for that.
Yeah. And I personally like to throw in an extra training too, because we all know that when buildings are handed over, that training is being done right after HVAC and right before this and right after that. And they're just getting them all through because the contractor's trying to get sign off to get their final payment, right? So we all know that there's so much information coming at an owner at that point that they're not taking it all in because they're getting so many systems tossed at them. So I personally like to throw in extra training to cover that.
And do you build that into your cost of the project, that extra level of service?
Yes. Yep. Or I'll throw it in. It depends on the job.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's all part of the evaluation, right? To say
Exactly.
we
Yep.
again, we want the rest of the building or the rest of their warehouse, and so we're going to make sure that they love on the system, and we'll take care of them. But if it's in general, you say, hey, look, we're going to build it in, and this makes life easy for everybody when you do that.
Yep. Exactly.
Well, Gary, thank you so much for joining us. I thought this was a really interesting conversation. I hope our listeners got a lot out of it because, it's an ever evolving industry. There's so much going on, and having somebody holding your hand certainly helps with people adopting these things. And so I think it was a really interesting, end result that we got with this conversation. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And I just want to say to both of you guys that I really enjoy watching your other interviews. I learn a lot, and together by sharing this information and kicking around ideas in this kind of a forum, I think it's super helpful for the industry. So thank you guys for all you do.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Well, hopefully you enjoyed that episode of the Lighting Controls Podcast with Gary Meshberg. Ron wants to just say a few words about our sponsor today, Toggled. Ron?
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, just want to thank Toggled for sponsoring the episode. Toggled is part of a global tech leader that provides software cloud solutions for simulation, IoT, high performance computing, and data analytics. They've got a really good grassroots approach to NLC, network lighting controls, and they've got Bluetooth in their lamps, which is something that's really unique and allows for really easy retrofits. So be sure to check that out. Cybersecurity, they've got you covered. Make sure you check that out as well. There are no fees for their API integration, which is truly something unique that they're offering. Very customer-centric approach, and they view the building holistically versus segmented control, which is a really big thing for us.
So check out Toggled, TOGGLED.com. Really great stuff they've got, and I'm really excited to see what other new stuff that they're going to come up with. Also, just want to mention that this podcast is presented by the Lighting Controls Association, or LCA, and is financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. And if you're listening to this on getagriponlighting.com, you should check out lightingcontrolspodcast.com, which is where this show will eventually be hosted. You won't be able to find new episodes on getagriponlighting.com going forward. So check it out, find out any news in the lighting controls world, and even check out some merch. Thanks so much, and thanks, Gary.